information that was put out earlier today, and I believe yesterday afternoon, relative to this being public participation. We've been following the same process for many, many years. There will be two public opportunities for the public to address the budget on February 23rd before the Common Council Finance Committee, and on March 2nd, I believe, or March 22nd from the Board of Estimate and Taxation. We encourage people to come out, let their feelings be known, and make us aware of what their thoughts are regarding the operating budget and the capital budget coming up for this fiscal year 23-24. Having said that, clerk, if you'll please call the roll.
Mr. Burnett,
Present.
Mr. Camacho,
Here.
Mr. Goldstein,
Here.
Ms. Najolski Eichner,
Present.
Ms. Smith, here, Ms. Ayers,
Present.
Mr. Ubelman,
Present.
Ms. Revoluz,
Present.
Ms. Young,
Here.
Mr. Kaides, Ms. McMurr,
Present.
Ms. Alterman,
Here.
Mr. Mead, Mr. Livingston,
Here.
Ms. Shanahan,
Here.
Mr. Kaides, Mr. Meek. We have 13. We have a quorum.
13 present, we have a quorum. The only item on the agenda is the presentation of the budget to the Common Council, so I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Dakowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I thought you would make remarks, so you caught me shorthanded.
For the regular meeting.
Oh, I see. Oh, special meetings. No. Okay, thank you very much. If I could share my screen now. Can everyone see that?
In a moment, we will. There we are.
Okay, great. So this is the mayor's recommended operating budget for fiscal year 23-24. Here's the process we'll go through tonight. We'll talk about the budget process as illustrated by the calendar. We'll present the recommended operating budget. We'll talk a little bit about COVID and ARPA funds, and then we'll go a layer down to the recommended operating budget by department for the city. We'll talk about our unrestricted unassigned fund balance, known as the rainy day fund. We then talk about how these budgetary amounts translate into a tax levy and mill rate for each district, and then a conclusion. So the way the process works, and most of you are very familiar, we start with a pro forma budget. The budget department prepares a pro forma with numbers. Headcount is so important, payroll costs. We know everyone is either on payroll right now or is a vacancy that's been approved, and we have a dollar amount for that. The controller helps us by projecting what the numbers for each person will be for the coming year, because they may have step increases, they may have union increases. Then they put down recommended numbers for each line item and distributes them to all the departments. That happened in late October. The departments then take about a month, they look it over, and they come back to us and input into our computer system their requested budgets. Budget department and I look it over, and then we have meetings with each department to review their requests, compare it to what was in the pro forma. We then discuss it with the mayor, and he comes out with his recommended budget starting last Thursday, last night and tonight. The Finance Committee has a public hearing on February 23rd in about 2 weeks. And then they make a recommendation, and the council sets the budget cap March 7th. The BET then sets meetings with each of the departments in the next following 2 weeks. And then the BET has a public hearing, March 22nd. After that, the BET forwards their tentative budget to the Common Council on the 27th. If they're Within the budget cap that was already established, there's not much more to be done. If it exceeds the cap, the council then has to vote to see if they approve the increased spending one way or the other. The council sets the final budget cap. We're scheduling it for the 11th, but according to statute, no later than the 18th. And then the BEP sets the final budget and tax levy on May 1st. Here is the recommended budget for fiscal year 24. What I'm trying to do on this slide is, first of all, give a historical perspective. So at the very top, the city local expenditures, excluding the Board of Ed, have gone from 157.5 up to 176. This past current year that we're in, 196, but we're looking at relatively flat 197.8 for the 24-year budget. However, it should be noted, let's get back to that prior slide. Oops. Here we go. It should be noted that there are expenses in the city's local expenditures that are on behalf of the Board of Ed. The in-kind services are those, let's say, the legal department, the accounts payable department, and payroll, IT. It has gone from 12 million, 13 down to 9.5. We're estimating for this coming year, $10 million. We also have debt service on the bonded debt on behalf of the public schools. We pay the principal and interest payments, but it's really on behalf of the schools. And that has ranged from 13.8 to 16, going up to 19.4 this coming year. So for this coming budget year, there's 29.4 million of expenditures that the city spends out of this 197 on behalf of the schools. So if you want to look at the local expenditures by the city on behalf of the city net, it's really $168 million. It's going down 1.6 million from last year's 170, a little bit less than 1%. For the Board of Ed, their expenditures have gone from 185 up to 198, 204, last year 217.8, and the mayor's recommendation this year is 226.6, a 4% increase. But we have to appropriately add the in-kind expenditures to get a true measure of what the local taxes are supporting for Board of Ed expenditures. So we add the same numbers, the 29.4, for a total of 256 million. That total local expenditure for schools has gone from 211 to 225, 229, 234, 244, 256. This year, on the recommendation of 4%, it's going up by 11.9 million or 4.9%. The second thing I just want to show on this slide is what is the allocation of local tax dollars between the city and the Board of Ed. And it's running at about 60% for the Board of Ed and 40% for the city. Now let's go to this slide regarding oh boy, here we go. Let's just review what the city has received for COVID and ARPA reimbursements. And you might have seen this slide before. So the city had reimbursements from FEMA for COVID expenditures of about 1.7 million. The CRF was the COVID reimbursement fund, which was distributed by the state of Connecticut, but it really was federal funds, COVID relief. The city got 1.9 million and the schools got 7.2 million, a total of 9 million. The schools also got another 451,000, Office of Early Childhood. Now the ESSER grants are what the schools get from the state of Connecticut, and we have different ESSER grants. They call them 1, 2, and 3. The ESSER 3 is their designation for their ARPA money. That total was 38 million. of which 24.8 was ARPA. We also got a small $127,000 grant, and that was to help us with voting during COVID. The city got $39.3 million for ARPA. The $22.1 million is as a city, but because the federal government also issued ARPA funds to counties, and Connecticut does not have functioning county governments anymore, the state said, we want that county money for our state, and we will allocate it to the cities based on per capita. So our allocation was 17.2. So we ended up with a total of 39.3 million of ARPA. So the total city funds were 43 million. The schools were 45.5 for a total of $88.6 million, which we received either for COVID or just ARPA funds. And out of that, 64.1 was ARPA funds. So we were beneficiaries, and we appreciate that funding from the federal and state governments. The recommendation this year is for the public schools to have an increase of 8.7 million or 4% over last year's approved amount, $217.8 million. That results in a recommended total amount of 226.6 million. We're recommending for the city an increase of 1.5 million or 0.75% over last year's approved 196.3 million. The total recommended amount for the city is $197.8 million. Now, doing a little bit of a deeper dive on what the city budget is by department. So we put this in order of the approved budget last year. And as you see, employee benefits was number one with 38.5 million. This year, it's coming in at 26.4, a reduction of $12.1 million or 31%. I have a separate slide to discuss that, but that's a very big part of why we came in with only a 0.75% increase. Debt service, number two last year, 35.3 million, is now number one, 40.4 million, an increase of 5.1 million, 14.3%. And as we have discussed before, we are increasing the gross amount of our debt that's outstanding. According to the records, according to our financial statements, as of June 30th, 2022, we had 305.5 million of outstanding general obligation debt. During fiscal year 2023, we make payments of principal that paid off 25.9 million of that debt. But last summer, we issued 82 million of new money GO debt. When you net that out, we are currently sitting with 361.6 million of debt, significant increase. As everyone is aware, with inflation rising and interest rates rising, a year and a half ago, we borrowed at 2%. Last year, we borrowed at 3.6%. Historically, that's still a very good rate, but it just increases our debt service. And those are the two contributing factors. So that's why it went up $5 million. The police are number two, but they came in exactly at 3.5%, a 962,000 increase on last year's budget of 27.5 million. Public Works came in with an increase of 2.4 million or 9.3%. And two major components there out of that 2.4 million increase. It mostly has to do with trash, waste, and recycling. It used to be that when our trash was removed, the recycling elements were separated and sold, and we got a credit. The market for recycled elements has changed. Supply and demand has reversed, and we now have to pay to have those recycled elements taken away rather than getting a credit. That increased our cost by $1 million. Additionally, we have a new contract with City Carting for solid waste, and that went up by $800,000. So out of the 2.4 million, a full 1.8 million was because of those two items. And without those two items, their increase would have been reasonable. Fire department went up 3.4%, below the mayor's target of 3.5%. Pension plans, 15.7 went up to 18.1, $2.4 million increase, 15%. I will also talk about that on the next slide. The rest of the budget is either very close to the 3.5% or small dollars because it's off a very small base. So for example, 12.8% increase on contingency was on 1.3 million. We normally have a $1.5 million contingency every year. Last year, working with the BET to make some of the changes they requested, we gave up 170,000 of our budgeted contingency even before the year started. And that's why the budgeted number was 1.33. Grants, we went from 896,000 to 1.4 million, an increase of 493,000. The reason is this year we are giving a grant to the Housing Redevelopment Authority of $500,000, which we hadn't in prior years. So that is explaining the whole increase there. The rest of the numbers are pretty reasonable. Equity and inclusion, we have a new officer. So we gave a new department and a budget, and legislative went up 56%. That's all of you, but we're talking $9,600. Let me talk about those key drivers I postponed. Employee benefits and insurance was recommended 26.4, a change of 12.1 reduction, 31%. Health insurance. As we were going through our budget preparations, we discovered an error. 2 years ago, the city changed suppliers from United Healthcare to Anthem. As part of that process, the controllers group has to set up different codes to hold the co-payments that are made by our employees toward the health insurance. And unfortunately, the way it was set up, it was mapped to go into the Board of Ed's health insurance sub-account within our insurance fund. So that means they were getting credited for all of the co-pays from our employees. So their health insurance fund was overstated and the city's health insurance fund was understated. The error was about 5.2 million because it was 2 years worth. And it made sense because when we looked at the June 30th, 2022 balance in the Board of Ed's health insurance sub-account, they had a balance of about 5.9 million. So we talked to Linda Usmani and the Board of Ed, and we said 5.2 of that is really our funds. So we're going to transfer that from your sub-account to our health insurance sub-account. I had already projected how much we needed to budget for the health insurance. This 5.2 million is a one-time offset, which reduces our required budget amount. OPEB, that's other post-employment benefits, primarily it's health insurance benefits for retirees. In talking with our actuary, he explained, we are very well funded in our OPEB trust fund. The last time I looked, half of Connecticut cities do not even have a trust fund set aside. And I doubt there's anyone who has a 95% funding ratio that we have. So we've been aggressively funding this trust fund for the last several years to get to that 97% funding. And we also hit very good stock market and investment returns. So when we have good contributions and good investment returns. And then there was a third factor that the usage of health resources, whether it's physicians, hospitals, or other health expenditures, was lower than the actuary had planned. And they explained to me that that has happened with a lot of their clients because of COVID. Many people did not go out and see their doctors or get health care as frequently as they might have normally. So with those three items combining, our OPEB contribution this year was reduced by $8 million from last year. The actuary did warn me that he has seen in other cities that this bounces back a little bit, that after COVID, the retirees start going back to the doctors and getting health care that they may have put off during COVID. So it's not like we're down to a level that will persist going forward. There may be an increase. I doubt it will go up the whole 8 million, but I would be expected for this to go up 3-4 million next year. But those are one-time positives that benefit us. When I looked at our workers' comp sub-account in our insurance fund, had a discussion with a different actuary who works on our workers' comp. And there's a factor in there called IBNR, incurred but not rated, okay? So the reality is, but not reported, incurred but not reported. What that means is we may have workers who have had injuries, but they haven't reported the damage and we haven't gotten all the expenses. And it doesn't stay constant. He explained to me someone might have been injured 5 years ago, and we estimated that the cost would be $350,000. And then several years later, the conditions worsen and they need additional treatment. And that $350,000 might now be $500,000. So IBNR is the actuary's estimate of the total liability that we may be facing in the future. It's one of those things that can come through at any time. And to be conservative, I wasn't sure that the amount we had in balance on that sub-account was sufficient. So I took 1 million from the health insurance 5.2 and I plugged it back into workers' comp just so that I could beef up that buffer for the IBNR. Debt service we talked about, the 40.4 is an increase of 5.1 million, 14.3%, and pensions. Now with pensions, the actuary who does OPEB is also our actuary for pensions. And we had a preliminary number when he first looked at us, which would have been an increase of 1.4 million. But last week, just about a week ago, we had a conversation and he said, I want you to bump that up by 1 million. It's just the opposite of what the retirees had. The employees in our pensions here, primarily police and fire, intensively used healthcare and had healthcare expenditures greater than what we anticipated. And he said, the three main pensions are police, fire, and city. The city is a closed plan. There are no new entrants. New employees are on a defined contribution plan where they put money into investments. And if they go up, they go up. If they go down, they go down. But our obligation is different. We just match what they're putting in up to 5%. With a defined benefit plan, the older plans, if there are market losses or if there are additional expenses beyond what we anticipate, we have to cover them. So for the police, he said, because of their intensive usage, increase that by 500,000. And for the fire, put in 400,000 more. The city, which only has fewer employees that have been grandfathered in, put in 100,000 more. So that's why the increase was 2.4 million, 15.4%. Okay, let's look at the rainy day fund. Now, a rainy day fund, as with any organization, We don't look at it in isolation. Okay, rainy day fund, 69.7 million, 70.9 million. What does that mean? We have to relate it to our size organization. If we were spending $1 billion a year, this is very small. But based on our expenditures, 348 million, 363, we then look at the unrestricted unassigned fund balance and then look at that ratio to determine whether that's an adequate rainy day fund. So here's our total general expenditures, historical actual through 22, the current year budget of 23, and the mayor recommended budget for 24. Here's the historical rainy day fund, 69.7, 58.4, 72.4, 74.9. And the way we work with our auditors, when we establish a drawdown in our annual operating budget, so we're drawing down money from the rainy day fund to help soften the tax increase for our citizens. If we do that before June 30th, the auditors say we have to take that 4 million out of the rainy day fund, unrestricted, unassigned. We don't lose the money. It goes into a different category of fund balance called assigned. Because you've determined that you're going to use it, it's not open and available to you. So 74.9, the current year we budgeted a $4 million drawdown. And you know that we run a budget with balanced revenues and expenses. So if we come in on budget and we use that 4 million, the rainy day fund would go down to 70.9. This year's budget, we are planning on using $6 million, a drawdown from the rainy day fund, to soften the tax increase for our residents. So if the rest of the budget comes in, revenues equal expenses, the 70.9 would drop to 64.9. 70 minus the 6 gets you to 64.9. So now we take these rainy day balances and divide them by the total general fund expenditures. 20%, 16.1, 19, 19.4, 17.1, 15.3. I should mention our financial advisor and the rating agencies have informed me that the Northeast of the United States is very different from the rest of the country. In the rest of the country, it's very common to have percentages of 50% up to 100%. People know it's a buffer, it's protection, it's insurance, and they plan a way for it. But for some reason in the Northeast, we work with lower levels. So the city's recommendation is to be between 7.5% and 15%. So we're at 20, 16, 19, 17.1. With the $6 million drawdown, we would be at 15.3%, right at the top of our recommended policy. So this is a very important consideration for the rating agencies. Have to recall that the rating agencies' mission is to analyze the city's finances and to protect the investors in our bonds. And when they see a healthy rainy day fund, they say, well, if they don't make the revenue they thought, or if their expenses go up beyond what they thought, or both, well, we know we've got a rainy day fund. So we know the city could just draw down that rainy day fund to pay the principal and interest as it comes due. Consequently, this is not only insurance for the city, but very important to helping us maintain our AAA bond rating. And last, let's now translate all of the revenue and expense items to get into the actual mill rates and the average tax bill. So these are the expenditures. Last year's budget, 414.17. Mayor's recommend budget for fiscal 24 of 424.4 million. a blended 2.46% increase. The recommended mill rate by district is 25.43 for the first three districts, 25.5061 for the fourth, 25.3158 for the fifth, 24.3575 for the sixth. Remember, we have a core mill rate based on all the services that all six districts get. The fire services are allocated only to districts 1 through 5 because the sixth district provides their own fire service. So we back out those costs and then allocate them to these 5 districts. Take the costs, divide by the grand list for each district, and then we add up all of those changes. We do the same thing with trash. Trash is offered as a service to the 1st through 4th districts, and street lighting is offered to the 4th and 5th districts. Again, we carve out those expenses, and then we come up with a mill rate just for those services, but instead of allocating them to all 6 districts, only for the districts that receive those services. The 10th district is for motor vehicles. It is remaining the same. It's been there for at least 2 years, 30.4670. And you should be aware that is below the maximum cap that the state allows us to charge. So now that we have the mill rates and you have the increases in mills and the increases in percentages. The low percentage increase was 3.03 in the 5th. Most of the districts are 3.3 to 3.6, and the 6th district is 6.21%. I should note, in the 6th district, they get a mill rate from the 6th taxing district. I speak to the controller there, and he tells me, this is the amount of money I need to raise for my budget. Please add on a mill rate charge, and I collect it for them and pass it on to them so that they can meet their budget. So that's built into their mill rate as well. We take the median home values from the 2019 grand list, and now we multiply the recommended mill rate times the median home value to get an average tax bill. So in the 1st district, 6108, increase of 214.363%. And you could go along and see what those changes are. The changes go from $201 to $280, and the 6th is 1,089. The percent increases because the median home value used did not change from last year. Whatever the percentage increase is on the mill rate, the tax bill, the average tax bill increase is the same. Okay. In conclusion, as the mayor has pointed out in his remarks, this is a balanced, fair budget with fiscal restraint, affordable for Norwalk single-family homes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dakowitz. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Mr. Livingston?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So, Henry, so let's go look at the mill rates, right? Obviously, being my district, 6th taxing district, I'd like to know more about it. I'm not happy about it, of course. So when I look at this, I want to understand better how the district grand list and the calculation fits into this. When we spoke last week, I think it was, you said 6 TD grand list had gone down. I think you said $18 million. And I guess I'm struggling with that, given that we're using the October 1st, 2019 grand list for everything else. How does that factor into this?
We are not using the 2019 grand list. We're using the grand list for the median home value. Okay. And remember, that's a median, and that, individual taxpayers will have different numbers based on what their actual assessed value is. So, as I said before, the core which the sixth district gets with everyone else, went up because we have an increase in our spending. That's number one. The second component of your mill rate is for the sixth taxing district. Last year, that mill rate for the sixth taxing district expenses did not change. This year, it went up. So that's a second component.
But Henry, I'm going to stop you there because that went up $80,000, which is roughly $50 a household. So
What
it's
do you
really
mean
not a,
$80,000?
that's what they told me from the commissioners. So that really doesn't account for the much of the 6.21%, right?
Well, there's a third component. The third component is that the assessed grand list for the sixth district has gone down this year. And Bill Ford, the assessor, explained to me there were a number of homes which have been taken down in anticipation of reconstruction. Okay, so it doesn't go down to zero because a vacant 2-acre lot in Rowayton has value, but it has less value than if it had a home on it. So what's happened is, just as we increase the assessed value when there are additions and positive changes made, we reduce the assessed value when it goes down. So during that construction, that homeowner will pay less taxes. Their assessed value has gone down. But as most of you are aware, if the assessed value goes down, the mill rate goes up because we have to get to a certain amount of taxes to be raised. So the three components were the core, the sixth taxing district, and a reduction in the assessed value, the grand list for that district.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much time. I know others have questions, but one more. So this is a moving target, the grand list, right? For all districts, right? That's
Well,
what
the
you're saying.
grand list, let me explain. The grand list is just the sum of all the assessed values. The assessed values change during the 5-year process between revaluations. If you make an addition to your home, you take out a building permit. And when you finish the construction and you have a certificate of occupancy, inspectors come in, they see what has changed, and they change the assessment. Usually it's an increase. If, God forbid, you had destruction of your house or a storm that damaged it, the inspectors would come and reduce your assessed value. So we haven't done the full reval. That will be done by October of this year. But the point is, again, on an individual home by home basis, things change, move up and down all the time.
I
And it's
get
not
that, Henry, I get that.
Okay,
I'm just trying to figure out when you're going to nail it down.
what do you mean nail it down? The point is,
Because you have to use some date, right? You have to use some date when you set your mill rate, right?
Yes.
Right,
Yes.
and that's the date I'm
the
curious about.
the assessor got a 1-month extension, and the grand list will be filed February 28th. So once the grand list is filed for the year, those are the numbers that we will use, and the movement, any other movement, will be picked up in next year's reval.
But, okay, one last question. So that's the October 1st grand list, right? Or is it
What
He
year
got
are
the
you talking about?
he got the extension to
The October 1, 2022 grand list is normally done by January. We
Right.
got a 1-month extension to February of 23, the end
Right.
of this year.
so the February 23 one, it will be the October 1st, 2022, right?
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
you're welcome.
I can't see anybody. Anybody out on Zoom from the council like to ask a question? Okay, I don't see any hands raised. Anybody here? Mr. Najolski.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Henry, a number of questions, starting a little bit where Mr. Livingston left off. There is an increase, looking in the budget book of the net tax levy by, it looks like about $16 million, if I'm reading that correctly. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to where we're seeing the increases, and does any of this have to do with some of the tax abatements on some of our larger developments beginning to run out?
let me explain how the net tax levy is calculated. It starts with the expenditures. We take the Board of Ed expenditures, the city expenditures, and add them up. 424.36 million is the recommendation. We need to have a tax levy to get that much tax money into our coffers so that we have a balanced budget. We then add to that the tax adjustments. Those are for elderly tax relief, other programs, let's say for veterans, and tax appeals. So here's a situation where we will not be collecting the money we expect because it's a designated program to benefit certain groups of people, or it's because of tax appeals. That total this year is 3.6 million. We add that to the departmental expenditures and say, okay, we need 424.4, and we also need 3.6 for these tax adjustments. That
Henry,
gets you-
sorry, Henry, let me stop you because I think then I was looking at the wrong line. The question I'm actually trying to ask is increases in revenues. What I'm trying to understand is how much has the city revenue increased over last year? And I'm having trouble finding that line. I see the increase in the gross tax levy, or I see the number for the gross tax levy, but I'm not seeing a percentage increase.
Okay, if you go up a couple of blocks, there's something called other tax revenue.
Yep,
There's back tax collection and supplemental auto. Last year, we budgeted 5.6 million, and this year we're budgeting 5.6 million. On the non-tax revenue, right below it, it's about 6 lines worth.
uh-huh,
Last year, that was 45.8 million, and this year it's 37.8 million. That's mostly composed, that's a reduction of 7 million. That's mostly composed of the fact that we're not going to get ARPA monies this year into our budget. The third component is the fund balance transfer. That's the drawdown from the rainy day fund. This year, we budgeted 4 million. For this coming 2024 year, we budgeted 6.
What
So-
page are you looking at in the budget books?
Can you explain what page in the book it is?
yeah, it's in the first section. It doesn't actually have a page number on it. It's under the budget message section. It's the last chart in that section. So right before tab 2, city profile.
Roman numeral,
It's under Roman numeral 1,
first
basically
thing.
the last couple pages of Roman numeral 1.
Great, thank you.
So Henry, but I guess I'm asking just, I think, a simpler question. So if I'm looking at the gross tax levy correct line, it looks to me like we are estimating an increase in the gross tax levy of 44 million. Is that correct?
No. The gross tax levy, in the middle of the 5 columns is the final budget for fiscal 23.
Yep, at 422 million.
Right. The middle column right next to it, this 466, that's what was requested.
Oh, I see. The 433 is what's recommended.
433 is recommended, so we're looking at 10.5 million.
Okay. So what I'm trying to understand is that we have had a lot of growth in our grand list, correct? Now I know that some of that growth is still under tax abatements. And so, for instance, the mall has not fully come online. You know, some of the housing, the apartment buildings have not fully come online. But what I'm trying to understand is what amount of additional tax revenue are we seeing as a city that is coming from new development? And not just from sort of increases in taxes on our existing homeowner population.
I don't think of it that way. It's not like we send an invoice and some people are paying more. What happens is we back into those numbers. There's no line item for real estate taxes and personal property taxes. What happens is we calculate this formula to get to net tax levy. That's what we have to get a balanced budget. We then say, okay, how do we tax everyone in the city? And real estate taxes and business and personal property taxes are at the same mill rates. So we take the assessed value for all the real estate and all the business personal property, put it together, divide that into the net tax levy, and we get mill rates. and average tax bills. Okay, that's how we're doing it. What will happen is if you have new construction and the assessed value goes up, right? When we had the mall, the assessed value went up $500 million. The abatement, which you keep referring to, was done as 50% for 7 years. So they're paying as if they had a $250 million structure, and they'll do that for 7 years, and then they'll go back to the full value of 500 million. Okay, so when they came on board, the total grand list increased, which means that when I look at the average for the city, if the mill rate, if the assessed value grand list goes up, the mill rate goes down. That's what happened with the reval in 2017, with the rebound from the recession. Okay, in 2012, right after the recession, the assessed value went down and the mill rates went up. And in 2012, it went the other way. The point is, the total taxpayers have to pay the net tax levy. The assessed value is only a method of allocating the costs fairly. So when these developments go off abatement, they go up a little bit. The year that the mall came, it was a quirk. They didn't get their abatement until after the first year because they didn't get their certificate of occupancy by a certain date. So when they came on board, the assessed value grand list in that district went up by $500 million. So if you were in that district, remember, the same amount has to be collected, but now you have someone else who has $500 million of value who's going to take a share of that. So your taxes will proportionally be a little bit lower.
Right, no, that's exactly what I'm trying to get at. I know we're gonna get a presentation on this, but I'm trying to draw out some of the value that we have gotten as a city from having, as you said. So I guess the way to talk about it is that the cost of these tax levies have been spread across a larger number of taxpayers who are paying potentially at a higher level. Okay.
Right.
Thank you. That was all the information I was just trying to get at, is some sense of what that amount of spread is, but if it's not calculated that way. Okay, I have a few tiny questions, Nick questions, but I'll leave for other people if they've got more general.
I just want to give a heads up. I guess we have 6 minutes before we have to recess.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to look back.
Sorry, there's 6 minutes on the next meeting, so just we're gonna have to get everyone back on to the next meeting.
I'm going to go back to those out there and on Zoom. Any questions? I guess Ms. Revolus, Mr. Goldstein, Ms. Alterman, Ms. Young.
No, not at this time, Henry. That was very helpful.
Sorry, I had my hand up. I just have a quick question. It may have already been mentioned. So the, oh my gosh, I'm going to use the wrong words for the cannabis that's legal now, the selling of that. Have they decided what you're doing with the revenue from that tax wise?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry, I was speaking over you.
Sorry, I don't have it eloquently stated. I'm just curious how much of any of the money coming in from like legal cannabis sales are going to go towards any of the school budget or anything like that for the city.
I don't think that's been determined yet, Josh.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. There
Okay,
is no
that's all. I
cannabis
was just
money yet
asking if it
because
had
there's
been
no
determined.
retail establishments yet. There's no cannabis anything yet. We've just approved rules.
Okay, that's all. I just was wondering if it had been like determined what you would do. Okay.
Well,
thank you.
also the state law does have some strings attached to those funds that kind of predetermine that as well.
I think what will happen is, as the rules firm up, then we can financially try to estimate what the revenue would be. And just like we did with the ARPA funds, we'll probably come back to your good folks to determine how you want to allocate it and comply with all the rules.
Thank you, Mr. Goldstein. Any further questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, if anybody on Zoom wants to raise their hand. Okay, thank you, and I will accept a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Revolus, all in favor?
Yes.
Opposed?
See you in
Abstention?
a few.
We are adjourned at 7:23. Thank you.